evening. What a pleasure to welcome you to the Poison Pen, Mr. Hirsch. I've become a fan since I read your first book here, The Devil's Half Mile, which I thought was fabulous. And if I remember right, we sent them to you and you signed them, but
That's
you weren't
right.
able to join us.
Yes, unfortunately not, but it was a pleasure to sign them, and it's great to come here and sign them again. Thank you very much.
Well, you've come on the night of the Great Flood, but you know, that's how it is. So Patrick is joining us because Patrick is a fan of all things Irish, and also of hard-boiled and noir detective fiction. And I've said to him,
it's right up my alley.
it really is. That basically that's what you're writing, except we are in roughly 1800 New York City instead of modern Hell's Kitchen.
That's right. I find that most of the novels that are written in kind of 19th century New York tend to be quite literary, and I have to confess I'm much less literary. I'm very keen on the noir novel and the way that those kind of that kind of form is written. I'm a huge fan of Donald Westlake, for example, and those types of really small, quite violent often, but very kind of cynical types of works, and I try to sort of fold that into that period, because part of this I think was quite a cynical time, frankly.
It was, and you're dealing, especially in your second book, with very topical issues. You're dealing with immigrants, you're dealing with hostility between immigrant communities, you're dealing with property developers and speculation because nobody knows quite where the grid of the city is going to jump north. You know, it's so hard for us to even think about New York, right, Patrick, as a pastoral island with just all the stuff down there at the very tip. You know, I mean, it was dairy farms, and even in Edgar Allan Poe's time, he lived on a farm, somewhere up in Midtown today.
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating time.
Yeah, it was remarkable for me to learn about that period, because I always, and of course New York looks like it, I mean, it's been built on a grid quite clearly, which means it clearly has been planned in some way. But I didn't realize that quite so early on the city fathers had decided so many people are coming off these boats every day into New York that we're going to have to, we're going to grow really fast, and we're going to have to cover the whole, we're going to have to pave the whole island over, so we need a plan for that. And to make a decision in 1797 like that you were actually going to carpet the whole of this island of Manhattan, like smooth it down, put the roads down, build on it, was quite a remarkable decision, I think, to make at the time. So, but of course it had all sorts of implications in terms of development, as you mentioned, but it kind of fascinated me about how that came about.
Remind me when ownership went from Holland to Britain.
Oh, that was
much earlier.
Much earlier, like nearly a century before. I want to say something like 1664.
I think somewhere in there, but if I recall, the wall was actually the line. Wall Street today, we think, but that was as far as the Dutch really went, wasn't it?
Absolutely right. That's where they built the palisade, and originally it's literally a fence of wood with spiked posts on the top, and that was to keep the natives out, because the natives were like, hey, hang on a second, you guys are making loads of money here, let's have a piece of it. So they used to try and raid into the city, and they raided the farms that were set up very tentatively up Manhattan Island. But yeah, so the Dutch decided they needed to keep them out, so they built a wall along Wall Street. And I think there are parts of Wall Street now you can still see the sites in the cobblestones where those poles used to stand. So
sort of like Hadrian's Wall.
Kind of like Hadrian's Wall, not quite as evocative, but yes,
right,
similar.
With different paving stones. But
Indeed.
Gosh, isn't that depressing to think that the wall is actually not just a Trumpian concept, but in point of fact, we've tried it before.
No, we've tried it before, and it was actually quite successful then. I mean, it was built across the whole of the tip of Manhattan, which if you've ever walked along Wall Street, and beyond over the hump of Broadway. That's quite a significant length.
Was it New Amsterdam at that time?
It was New Amsterdam initially, yes. Yeah.
But in fact, that really is Hadrian's Wall, which was designed to girdle the wall between Scotland and England and went all the way across. So the same thing, which works. I see that we have extra pyrotechnics thanks to the storm.
It's very atmospheric.
Really is.
It's a perfect mystery.
This is the haunted poison pen.
For today.
Good night for
Justice Flanagan is a really interesting character. There was already a significant population of the Irish even this early?
Oh yeah, so when we think about the Irish in New York, we always think about that kind of gangs of New York time of the 1860s.
The famine.
The famine, exactly. There was that large-scale immigration. But in actual fact, the Irish had been coming across since the end of the Revolutionary War.
Was that because I think it was 1799, the Irish and the British had a big fight, and a lot of the Irish, I think, like the Scots after Culloden, were more or less exiled.
Well, that was part of it. So 1797 was that rebellion,
Right.
which was put down very, very harshly,
It was.
1797, 1798, and a lot of Irish left then. But even before that, the Irish were coming across, because if you think about it from their point of view, Catholic Irish really kind of oppressed by the British for, centuries at that point. And then they look across, or they hear news coming across the Atlantic about these Americans who've overthrown the king, kicked the army out, and they must have thought, wow, this is amazing. Let's go. This sounds like the promised land, milk and honey. So large numbers of Irish jumped on ships then and got themselves across to New York. And of course, unfortunately, they found that they'd really just jumped from the frying pan into the fire, because New York was still essentially an English city. Remember, New York was occupied by the British right the way through the Revolutionary War. There was only a very small period where the Continental
Right.
Army were in charge of New York. And it meant that whilst the army and the top of the administration went back to England, most of the rest of New York stayed, and they were all English, effectively. And they had the same prejudices against the Irish that the English had. They regarded the Irish as subhuman. They regarded Catholics as, beneath contempt. They were mostly Protestant. And I've found, tracts at the time, religious tracts at the time, raging against Catholicism. So, the Irish come across, they're Irish and they're Catholic. So it's almost kind of, double jeopardy in that situation. It's a nightmare for them.
Had Boston been established as an Irish area yet?
Again, so the two points of entry really for ships coming across were Boston and New York. So, Boston was a good place for them to go, and in many ways better, because it was a smaller city, so they were able to concentrate power more quickly. But it still took, 50, 60 years before the Irish really started to get a decent toehold politically. Of course, by the end of the 1800s, the Irish were in control of New York, and it was a whole different story, but, it took them a century to get there.
I started to ask you, why you chose this particular moment in history to write your series, and you started to give me interesting answers. So can I hear that?
Well, so I'm a journalist by trade, and finance and economics.
I know.
This is great.
I think it's great now. I think
Oh,
it's
yes,
fantastic.
I have.
And I wrote a book called Man versus Markets, which is kind of an explainer of financial terms and sort of an introduction to the way financial markets work. And a lot of the feedback to that was, this is great, can you explain why we have a stock exchange? Why do you need to have this sort of cartel, a bunch of guys who get together and control all the markets? So I thought I'd write about the way a stock market is created, and the best one to write about is New York, because the London and Amsterdam stock exchanges, which long established, took like 200 years to develop. New York was developed very, very quickly, because the Great Panic of 1792 was America's first financial crisis. And then there was this debate between Hamilton and Jefferson about whether or not there should be restrictions put around the market. And then a bunch of enterprising traders said, we're going to create our own little club, and we're going to put our own rules together, and there's the New York Stock Exchange. So it was intrinsic. It sounds interesting when I talk about it in 30 seconds. When you're writing a book about it, it is so boring. So I decided, and also I wasn't doing very much writing, I was doing a lot of research. So I decided to keep my hand in. I'll write a little murder into the narrative, and that's what I did. And the murder took over, and The Devil's Half Mile was the result. So I've kind of stuck with that theme now.
But Justice came to New York because his father had been murdered, right? Wasn't
That's
that
right.
the deal? He came to find out what had happened to his dad. I'm sorry, Patrick, I
No,
interrupted you.
let's just listening. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
it's interesting.
Well, I mean, it
Sounds like
is.
Shakespeare.
Well, yes. I mean, it just doesn't it all sound like Shakespeare?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, yes.
Right. So here he is in the city. You've recovered from the financial panic, and the city. When he went, where did he go away to university? Did he go back to England?
He went to Ireland. He went to
Ireland.
He went to the first Catholic university, which was established in 1797 in Maynooth, which is just northwest of Dublin. And
Okay.
so he went there and he studied law. And after he'd done a couple of years there and spent some time actually taking part in that rebellion we talked about, then he came back to find out who murdered his father.
And he ends up in law enforcement. I mean, he becomes a constable for the city of New York. And
Was this a real historical character?
No, but the real historical character is a chap called Jacob Hayes, who was the first High Constable of New York, because New York didn't, as you probably know from your reading of Gangs of New York, New York
Sure.
didn't have a police department until 1845. And prior to that, it was a very kind of ad hoc setup that they had for law enforcement. They had a fire watch, which basically were a bunch of guys who stood around in kiosks in the middle of the night with a clacking thing to, if they saw a fire, they alert you to it. But other than that, there were some constables and some marshals who were effectively executives for the court. So if somebody complained about something and they needed to find a witness, these guys would go out and find a witness. But there was no kind of detecting and no patrolling and none of that the kind of proactive law enforcement that we think of when we think of a police force.
Well, London didn't have a police force till 1831 or 32, and up till then they had the Bow Street Runners, who were also ad hoc.
They were somewhat
That
irregular,
was-
but they did have the Harbour Police though, who was a real police force, and that was from I think 1780 onwards. So certainly that
In
the
New
la-
York?
no in London.
Oh, you mean, okay, Harvard, or the Thames River?
Yes,
was
Thames,
that?
yes, exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
right.
And they and that was a lot of people modelled their police force on that force because that was very specifically to protect the waterfronts on either side, on the north and south of the Thames. But yes, the Bow Street Runners were the ones who were the kind of the irregular ad hoc, as you say, police force.
Right, if you're a fan of Regency literature, you know a lot about the Bow Street Runners.
Yes.
Anne Perry actually writes her William Monk series. He ends up in the Thames River police force. So that's where I know. The great thing about reading crime fiction is you learn all this stuff that you would absolutely never learn under, ordinary conditions. Anyway, so Justice is here in this book, The Devil's Half Mile. He's investigating his father's murder, and he gets caught up in things. But he also meets a young woman called Carrie O'Toole, who has an interesting background. So tell us a little bit about Carrie.
So Carrie is a childhood friend of Justy's. So Justy has this interesting situation where his father and his
No, I think
I think it's water
gotten
in the
into
electrical
system, yeah.
Either that or it's the invisible hand. But so whenever Justy's father and his uncle came across together from Ireland, and his father took the high road and tried to become a lawyer and go to Wall Street, the uncle took the low road and decided to become a gangster and take control of the waterfront. In the end, of course, Justy's father is murdered and actually found hanged during that financial panic of 1792, and everyone, because he's an aspiring stockbroker, everybody thinks he's hanged himself because he's lost his shirt. So Justy is then raised by his uncle. So he's in this interesting situation where he's quite well educated, but he's being raised by a gangster, and the uncle decides to be faithful to the father's memory, so sends him off to college in Ireland to do his legal training. Justy then comes back and meets with an old friend of his who's Carrie O'Toole, and she is the mixed race daughter of an escaped slave and one of Justy's uncle's henchmen. So
Plot thickens.
Right. So again, she's got feet in two camps as well. On the one hand, she's in the Irish community, on the other hand, she's in the black community. So she's kind of caught between these two communities, neither of whom like each other very much. In fact, hate each other because they are struggling for control of the jobs that are available for people who have sort of low-skilled jobs, and also for the criminal activities that are going on in the underworld. So both of them are kind of caught between these two stools, and therefore they find themselves thrown together again.
So you've got diversity, you've got racism, you've got...
We don't change much, do we?
No.
I mean, the point I was making to you, Patrick, for your hardboiled group is that this is just like reading contemporary fiction.
Sounds like
Except, you get the added interest of the city. But I think all the issues you're raising are ones we're struggling with at the moment, including, Me Too. Mixed race community, and in the new book, which I thought was really fascinating, in Hudson's Kill, you now introduce us to a community of Arabs in New York, and they are living inside an enclave where they, again, a wall.
Indeed, another wall.
A wall.
To keep people out this time.
Yep.
Yes.
And so one of them is found foully murdered, and like Jack the Ripper, a really horrible murder. And Justy gets involved in that. So now we've got the black community, the gangsters, corrupt City Hall, we've got the developers, we've got the Arabs over here. It's fascinating.
It's
I'm just a
brilliantly
big
done.
when does the big population boom in New York really hit? Is it during the industrialized?
No, it was right around that 1860s point. So, in 1800, the population of New York was about 65,000. In 1860, it was 1 million. So you can see that was the kind of the rate of explosion. It was all immigration.
Are you talking Manhattan or the whole state?
I'm talking Manhattan.
Yeah.
Wow.
It
Just
was the big revolutions in Europe after the French Revolution were in 1848, and then the Irish famine, and so people, left
Coffee and chips.
Italy. It was Ireland. There was just a tremendous amount. Lots of Scandinavians came and populated the Midwest. The Finns went to Minnesota. The Germans went to Wisconsin.
Right.
Just a huge, huge wave of immigration. But how else would we have settled the country?
Yeah, we were talking before about, I was mentioning there's a book by Mark Halperin called The Winter's Tale, I think it's called.
Yeah.
Big epic story of New York. And what I remember about it was just that it talked about that real early, maybe the era that you're talking about, maybe even before, when it was very tribal and, I think there were still a lot of American Indians that were fighting, but then it talks about that. It's hard to imagine Manhattan, back then without any buildings, without any, the way you see it today, very.
And from what I've learned through my research, just looking at old old paintings of the time, is that it wasn't just farmland. It was really rugged farmland.
Yeah.
I mean, the relief was incredible. I've seen.
John, no, come back. We're actually using that.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
It's
Little
words of a
interruption
you
there.
Now you're
Sorry.
taping yourself, John.
Take myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tammy needs to fix it. That's okay.
I
Thank you.
apologize.
This is what
No,
happens when
don't.
it rains.
It's all right.
This is part of the evening.
part of our exciting evening here this evening. Right, we're cleaning up from the water damage. Thank you, John. I'm
Yeah.
sorry I should have told you. Yeah, no, it was a very. I read quite a few things, as I say, about Poe, and how going up to outside the lower part of Manhattan, it was a really rough trip into the country.
Yes.
And
And Alexander Hamilton decided to build a house sort of 3/4 of the way up Manhattan, and it took him quite a long time to get up there. If he was
Right.
if he was on Wall Street doing whatever he was doing at the Federal Hall, and he had to go home, it took him a solid day to get up there because.
And if
it
you
was
go today
a
to
long
Fort
way.
Tryon Park, which is up there on the, it's interesting to take one of the circle boat tours around the whole island. It goes from, what is it, like the 36th Street Pier, I
Yes.
think, on the Hudson, and it goes south and all around up through Brooklyn, and it goes way up north, where the island and the mainland come, and then it comes down past Fort Tryon Park,
That's right.
which is where the cloisters are, which I love.
Oh.
But I mean, there are serious palisades up there. You're on very high cliffs.
Very high cliffs.
There was a lot of water too. I mean,
Yes.
we have the Hudson. You've got the East River. It's hard to see it today under all. I had a similar experience when I was in Shanghai in 1997. My husband and I were there. There's an island opposite Shanghai, which was a very European developed, had something called the Bund, where all the Europeans had their, and it was a low, what's the right height, low height, all the rest of it, and this island was essentially empty.
Hmm.
And now it looks just like New York and Sydney. They've built it all in like 20 years,
Yeah.
and but I can remember how the island looked when you
You looked out and it was
it was just an island, yeah.
I experienced the same thing in the same place. I remember seeing that, and I went back to Shanghai 10 or 15 years later, relatively recently, and it's unrecognizable.
Absolutely. So is Macau. When we
Yes.
took the hydrofoil across, and so for us, we think of New York, as this glittering skyscrapers, financial center and all the rest of it. But at the time you're writing about, it
It's
was
extraordinarily rural. Yeah.
it was rural. It was a port.
Mm-hmm.
None of the things that we think about it.
You see those early photos of right before automobiles came in, just cow dung, horse dung
Oh, yes.
everywhere, just piled
Yeah.
high in the corners.
That was actually a job, for people to sweep the stuff
Yeah.
out of the streets, and I didn't think we recognized just how dirty it was.
No, it was-
Sherlock Holmes, it's so romantic, with the Bow Street runners and the crossing sweepers and all, but it was really pretty disgusting.
Filthy, yes. And
And-
the Thames reeked apparently in London, and
Yeah.
in New York they would collect the horse manure and then sell it to the farmers, who would obviously
Right,
truck it
right.
up. But of course, when they started developing, and those farms didn't exist anymore, and then they really had a problem with horse manure, and they also had a problem with pigs, because
Yeah.
the tenant farmers who lived on that land that was being developed, they were kicked off the land. But the store of income for them, the store of their money, was their livestock. Now, cows were really a terrible pain to keep, because they're large, you've got to milk them, they're not particularly smart, you know. Chickens were a nightmare because they sort of run around, they're easily captured. But pigs are very intelligent, so they would be able to roam around the streets all day, and they would come back home at the end of the day, and they would also eat anything. So you didn't have to feed them, they would just go out and eat garbage, of which there was plenty in New York at the time. But of course it meant that the pigs were doing their thing everywhere, and the place just reeked the whole
Yeah.
time.
And not to mention flies and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, what inspired you to in your new book here, which is called
Hudson's Kill.
Sorry, thank you, Hudson's Kill. What inspired you to bring us, this community of Arabs with their own laws and their own customs and their own?
So I wanted to have another interested party in the kind of conflict that was going on in New York at the time. So there was a lot of conflict for, as I say, the kind of low-skilled jobs that both African Americans, escaped slave, runaway slaves, basically black people were only able to get because they obviously couldn't advance in society. And then the Irish also, who, as I've said, for these reasons, they're Irish and Catholic, they can't advance in society either. So there's only one type of job really that's available for these types of people, and that's menial work, labouring, maybe domestic service if you're a woman. So there was incredible competition for these two. But then I wanted to introduce something else to maybe find a way for them to have an alliance with each other. So I introduced this idea of a Muslim group, and I thought, how real would that be? And I was doing a little research I was actually looking for slave names, so that I could give another character who's an escaped slave or a freed slave, like a realistic name. So I was doing a bunch of research, and I came across a story about a community of slaves in South Carolina who were particularly valued because they were from West Africa, and they were rice farmers. And because they were very valuable to farm the rice along the Carolina coastline, because they were so valuable, firstly they were very expensive to buy, as people hate talking about the fact that you can buy and sell human beings, but these were very expensive commodities as people. But also because of that, their overseers, their owners, kind of turned a blind eye to their religion. It's going to keep you happy, and I want to keep you happy. You can just worship, but don't do your own thing, but just don't make it. Don't let anybody know about it.
Don't ask, don't tell.
Don't ask, don't tell. Exactly.
Yeah.
And in fact, what happened was several of those Muslim communities flourished. And I thought, well, and then the hurricanes were happening at the time. I thought, well, there's if a hurricane hit one of these communities and gave them a chance to escape, and maybe they made their way to New York, and so I kind of just followed that
Got
line,
it.
and that's how they arrived in New York.
Because there certainly were escaped African American slaves in New York. And
Many.
in fact, you have
Many, yes.
one in your book. I thought it was amazing. I mean, it never even occurred to me that would be a minority group or, an enclave in the city at this time.
And there were accounts of individual Muslims living in the city, and so it wasn't unheard of at all to have people of different religions other than just Christian, Protestant, and Catholic.
But what you've got is an aspiring mullah leader,
Right.
whatever, who's right.
Yes, I amped him up a little bit.
Yes, you did. Absolutely true. And you did create in this original murder a very Jack the Ripper scenario. And then, in fact, that's the question: was it a random killing, or was it? I don't want to give much away here, or was she a target killing? And if so,
Right.
why was she a target killing? And is it Carrie? Who's it that comes across her?
Carrie is the first one to
Carrie,
discover
right? That
when
finds her on the street dying.
Yes, yeah.
And so Carrie and Justy have a kind of contentious, because Justy is involved, at least at the outset, with the very proper daughter of a very wealthy man, and Carrie's not very pleased with that.
No.
But you contrived to bust that one up. So, so Justy is not going to marry into the what eventually became the upper 10,000.
No, indeed.
right.
Not
Just
at this stage
amazing
anyway.
characters. You're having such a good time with this, aren't you?
I really am. No, it's great, and they're really taking on a life of their own. So I'm really enjoying it. The
Cliffhanger endings too. You rat.
sorry.
I know you really do. So I noticed that you came with some. Is that a prepared thing that you might like to read a little
It
bit
is.
of? I don't want to waste it since you.
No, I'd be delighted. I had a little prepared to read if people would be interested in hearing my dulcet tones.
Sure.
Okay, well we've talked really
Get
about.
some highlights.
Yes, all right. Well, how about this? So, I'll read just a little clip here. It's a little sweary.
It's okay.
So when we join the story, Justy is on his way to see the bull, his uncle. Kerry has gone missing, and both her cousin Lou Owens and her father believe that she's been captured by the Muslim cleric and is being held in his compound on the bank of Hudson's Kill to the north of the city. Owens and the bull plan to assault the compound and set her free. Justy aims to stop the assault, but he's apprehended by one of the bull's men, a young fellow who takes a swing at him and ends up getting knocked to the ground. The man folded into the gutter. Justy stepped back to see a small crowd of men in waistcoats and farmers' caps filling the entrance to the street. "Move out of it!" A man pushed his way to the front. He was tall and broad-shouldered with a long-skirted black riding coat that flapped around him. His greying hair curled over a forehead bumped with pustules and a nose that looked as though an ox cart had driven over it. The young man pulled himself to his feet. "I'm sorry, Mr. O'Toole, O'Toole hammered the side of his bunched fist into the man's temple. The man's eyes rolled up in his head, and he went down, harder this time, like a fresh-cut tree. "Justice," O'Toole said, as though they were just passing on the street. "O'Toole, what do you want, son?" "I'm here to see my uncle." "No one passes. Not today. Not even you." "You can't just block roads in this city when you feel like it," O'Toole sneered. "I'll remind you, son, this here's the waterfront, which means it belongs to the bull, not them noddies you work with up by Federal Hall. The bull put up these buildings, and he paved these roads. If we'd have waited for your lot to lift a finger, we'd still be sloshing about in our own filth. So if the bull wants to close a street for a day in his part of the town, he'll damn well do it." Now O'Toole had a point. Since the war, the city fathers had deliberately ignored the poorer parts of the city and lavished all of their attention on the new developments, north and east, out to Corlear's Hook and along the Bowery. Canvastown and the East River waterfront, where the immigrants lived, got nothing. But the bull realised that by diverting some of the river of dirty money that flowed along the waterfront into some improvements brought him goodwill and protection. So he paved the roads with stolen stone and repaired the warehouses with pilfered timber, and the people loved him for it. "Fair enough," Justy said, "but I still want to see my uncle." "Well, he doesn't want to see you, so you'd best fuck off. And don't try going round the back, for my lads have orders to break the arms of any man trying to pass." O'Toole's face was like a wall, but the men behind him were smirking. Justy felt the frustration well up in him. "I know what you're planning, you and the Bull and Owens. We're planning to get my daughter back safe, Justice. Your uncle's goddaughter, that black bastard Owen's cousin. Family." Justy shook his head. "This isn't about Kerry. You and I both know she's just an excuse." "If you've come to lend a hand, Justice, you're welcome." O'Toole's eyes were as flat and as hard as the ice on a Mayo marsh in winter. "But if not, you'd best stand aside while we deal with these filthy heathens." Justy laughed. "Heathens, is it? And when was the last time you were in church?" He knew the answer to that one. It was nearly 20 years before, the day O'Toole's wife had died giving birth to Kerry. O'Toole had taken the squalling baby down to St. Peter's Church, wrapped her in a piece of green silk, and left her on the altar. And then he went to get drunk. O'Toole's face shifted in what might have been a smile. "I don't need some cock in a cassock to tell me what's unholy and what's not. These filthy devils are like a gangrened hand. You've got to burn it off and burn the stump if the disease isn't to spread." Very poetic, but Justy knew O'Toole didn't speak in riddles. If he talked about cutting and burning, it meant that he fully intended to gut every man, woman and child in the compound like so many fish, and then reduce the whole thing to ashes.
So they live in a place called Hudson's Kill, is the Arab enclave.
I see.
So that's why the book is called that. But
So you know if you know your geography of New York, you'll know where Canal Street meets the Hudson River. That little spat back in 1803, that was a small body of water, like a little inlet. It was a kill that when it flooded, was the water went high enough to actually get across. There was a whole marsh there, but it actually went across into this a place called the Collect Pond, which was a freshwater pond that's right around where Little Italy is today. So and this all disappeared during the development. They filled
It did,
in
all the kills. You
yeah.
wouldn't remember, but one of Linda Fairstein's books is all about the kills.
Right.
Yeah, which is because there were, so many outlets for. There was a lot of drainage, a lot of water in this area. Now it's largely been. It's like London. I mean, Fleet Street is paved over the River Fleet. There's a fabulous book by Christopher Fowler in which I think there are 12 rivers in London involved. There's a woman drowns in an underground dry chamber. And how can this happen? Christopher Fowler loves doing. Have you read any?
I have not. No, I have to.
They're wonderful. Yeah. You would love them. But anyway, so he explores then all the different rivers in London that over time have become, paved over and essentially well, they haven't disappeared, but they're underground. But we forget that that's also true in Manhattan. That all the little kills and other stuff, they're still there. It was marshy. Actually, I grew up in Chicago, which was a total marsh.
Right.
Which they reclaimed gradually with almost like Venice.
On the south side, right? Yes, my father-in-law was raised there, and these new developments that were literally, they were built really high up, and when they kind of filled in underneath the foundations to get the marshes away. Yeah.
Now I know Venice is the visible example, but there are actually quite a lot of cities that were constructed that way. So what you're doing is you're taking essentially a modern hard-boiled crime novel and giving us the flavor and the geography and all the rest of it of this period.
I'm so glad you see it that way, because that really was the aim, yes.
Yeah, no, it works totally for me.
Great.
I've read them both and thought, wow.
I have to see what Patrick's book club thinks.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Now, when you were researching your book on finance and markets, did you come across a lot of this material? Was that a kind of a discovery?
I came across a lot of this material.
So, wow, this is too good to.
Yes, I mean a lot of it came in the Library of Congress, which has a great kind of store of, I guess you'd call them travelogues. I mean, people would visit New York from all over the country, up from South Carolina, and they'd come across from London, and you have people coming from Amsterdam, and they would write accounts of their travels for their local newspaper. And these they still hold these in the Library of Congress, and some of them were incredibly descriptive. And they described the food, they described what people wore. A lot of the time they were very amusing, and a lot of them described the way people talked. And it was, they were just an incredible sort of mine of information. I thought, got to do something with this. I mean, it's fantastic.
How about the newspapers of the day?
Yeah, I mean, less so. They tended to be quite factual, the newspapers of the day. I mean, they got the yellow press, sort of early 1800s, really sort of got started, 1803, 1804, and and they were very successful. And then they started to get really lurid whenever crimes were reported. There's some great accounts of.
So you're moving into that era.
Sort of moving into that era. So I kind of pulled it back a little bit from there.
Yeah.
I remember Reese Bowen said that the most useful thing for her turn of the 20th century New York with her immigrant Molly Murphy were the advertisements, much more so than the actual news. But the ads were just full of information about what people wore, kind of soap they bought, I mean, just you name it.
And because all the artist depictions, it showed you what style hats they had and what underwear looked like, because it was fantastic
and
stuff.
How much it all cost.
And how much it all costs, which is that's a really tough one to figure out, because back then in the early 1800s and certainly the late 1700s after the war, there was so much kind of scrip around. There was so many different ways of paying for things. I mean, even at one point there was Mexican money you could use. I mean, it must have been incredibly confusing.
It was confusing. There was a really wonderful article in today's Wall Street Journal that was talking about the possibility of currency as we know it passing into not so much bitcoins but just digital money, and how the effects. And then they did a whole timeline that started in the 1700s of New York and our monetary system, and how it's really very well done all the way through the EU and so forth.
Can I digress slightly and ask you a question
Sure.
about that? Did you read the newspaper or did you read it online?
I read the newspaper.
You see, this is the thing, because I read the journal today and I missed that story, and I'm pretty sure that if I had read it in the newspaper, I would have read it.
And it was illustrated, so it had I start my day with coffee, the dogs, and the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Arizona Republic. And it's amazing how useful it is.
Yeah.
You know, you can, because we do these conversations all the time, and you know, it's astonishing how topical. Crime fiction has always been described as cutting along the edge of social change, whether you're in 1800 or today. And so the news really either presages the plot, or you know, or books that people are writing. You know, these same subjects are being explored. And I don't read well online, and I don't. Well, Patrick will laugh knowingly when I say this. I don't listen well, as we all know. So I don't like audio stuff all that well.
Well, I have to say,
so I just read it.
If you do like audio stuff, if I was going to get you to try something, I would get you to try the audio version of either of these two books, because the narrator who narrates them is incredible.
I've heard that. My husband is totally addicted to
Would
whoever
that be you?
narrated.
It would not be me. No.
I didn't think he was going to
No,
say
no.
that.
Good heavens.
No, we've had audio event. Remember, the Steve Berry narrator was here. We had a really interesting discussion about audio, and that comes up a lot, where people fall in love with the narrator. I will try it, because I recently joined a gym because I'm falling apart, and I'm gonna start listening to audio books while I'm doing my exercise.
Is it just too slow for you?
What?
Is it just too slow for you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
some people do.
Exactly.
Some people do amp the speed on their.
Well, I don't know that I can listen,
It
but
would sound terrible, I think. But
I read I just read so fast, and actually I have terrible handwriting because my hand can't keep up with my eyes. But I don't like listening because it, as you say, it is too slow for me. But
I could listen in the car, I think, but I don't think I could listen. If I
but
was able to read.
I'm going to try it. I thought this is, you know, if I take half an hour a day and I go down there and do my thing, and I can listen to some books that I otherwise would maybe never even get to.
Right.
It would be a good thing.
Well, this guy Ewan Morton, who reads this, he acts as the in the musical Hamilton as he plays King George.
Excellent.
And he's Scottish, which I won't hold it against him, because he does a great job of reading these particular books. And in fact, the way that he read The Devil's Half Mile was so I was so struck by it. It actually changed the way that I thought about some of my characters. And the way
Wow,
I wrote
really?
them. Yeah, really.
But
really
you know,
good.
I've heard other authors say they don't ever want to listen to their audio books or see any of the film adaptations, because then it would warp their own vision or you know, whatever. Everybody's different.
I'm happy for my characters to live, you
Yeah.
know, to go in unexpected directions. I'm happy with that.
So you see this as a ongoing.
Well, I have many ideas.
Excellent.
Yes, and you know, we'll see what happens with Hudson's Kill, and you know, we'll see if we if publishers are interested in picking up some more. I know that in the UK there's some interest, I think. So you know, we'll see how that goes. But I've got, I think, I could do a series of 8 probably, just on the ideas that I have right now, which is
So
great.
you signed what we call in the industry a 2-book contract.
Yes.
Which is what's normal for
Yes,
beginning.
for
And
beginning,
you've had
yes.
absolutely spectacular reviews.
Yes, no, the reviews have been great. I'm just hoping that the sales will follow on behind, and we'll be able to convince publishers to take up another 2 or 3 or 4.
That would be wonderful.
It would be great. Yeah.
I really find they're fascinating, and I agree with you that you've hardly started. I mean, you know, I got to the end of this and I'm thinking, so
Next.
yeah.
I'm so glad you felt that way. That's great.
No,
Thank
I
you.
did. I'm really delighted to have read them. I like historical fiction, but a lot of it is very much of its period. And what I like about yours is the fact that it feels so contemporary while I'm wallowing around in the mud and wherever it all is down there.
Clutching an orange to your nose because it smells so bad.
You know, you're absolutely right that we forget. We're so sanitized today. We have no idea how awful everything smelled. Many, many years ago when I was in York, they had the city I remember it was the gas company, in creating a new gas thing, had dug up an old Viking part of York. And so they decided to do a Disney thing, and they created this Viking theme park, and because they didn't want to pave it over and all, they put in a little trolley, a little tram. So you rode the tram around the little Viking, it's the Jorvik, I think. Something.
Yes, Jorvik, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So what they also decided to do was to make it smell like it always had, and they take you by the midden, and they take you by the hog farm and all, and I mean, people are dying on the tram.
That's
You know, it
great.
is so.
That's pretty right.
It's it's horrible.
Yeah.
It's really horrible. You know, and I thought good for them. You know, that they didn't try to, you know, sanitize it away, but to recognize people didn't have access easily to bathing, and you know, there was.
Yeah, people wouldn't have smelled that great either.
No, people didn't. There
Yeah.
was, you know, shit everywhere, to put it mildly. You know.
Vermin probably all over the place.
Yeah.
Oh yes, I think
Oh
so.
yeah.
There's
Abs-
if you read Charles Dickens' account of his visit to New York, which I think was in the 1840s, and in fact, he was. They say one of his guides on that trip to go and look at the tombs and things like this
Yeah.
was this chap Jacob Hayes, who was still at that time the High Constable. I think he just retired from being High Constable, and his description is unbelievable of New York. He goes at one point. He goes down some stairs into a building, and he says that all these heaps everywhere, and he just thinks it's like rag pickers have just dropped all their rags in there, or that's where they go to pick up the rags to pick out the rags. Then he realizes it's people, and that's where they sleep. And there are so many there that the rats can't get in there. They're like keeping the rats away, and the rats have to go somewhere else. Their description is unbelievable.
I wonder they didn't have more plague, and it's certainly understandable why cholera was such a tremendous problem.
And yellow fever used to burn through that city every
it
couple of
did.
years. And it was and
It's
plague
also
was
the
a
reason
monster.
people drink so much, because you couldn't actually drink water unless you sterilize it. So you know, they drank beer to sterilize the water, drank wine. But that was even true in ancient Egypt. You know, that people turned the water into beer with bread, essentially,
Right.
in order to create enough alcohol to sterilize it. So you know, we just think, you know, they like to drink, but in point of fact, that was how they got their water or whatever
And
it
yeah,
was.
so you had people of all ages drinking ale from a very, very
Absolutely
early age.
true.
Yeah.
Wow, this has been fascinating.
Yeah.
Anything else you'd like to ask him?
Not that I can think of yet, but after.
Why, your name is Paddy Hirsch, so we
Yes.
get to discern that you are Irish,
Yes.
right?
So I'm a marriage of the orange and the green, really. So my mother is from Dublin,
Okay.
and my father is from Armagh in the north of Ireland. So I went to school in Dublin for a while, then I went to school in Belfast for a while.
Okay.
And the name Hirsch it's a Jewish name, but I'm not Jewish.
Right.
I'm Irish Protestant, although don't really practice Protestantism so much anymore. But the family originally came from the Alsace-Lorraine area in France, but for a long time before. I think my
Wow.
great-great-grandfather left Alsace-Lorraine and went to Armagh and became a school teacher there, and that's how we sort of got.
So an immigrant
into
to
Northern
Ireland
Ireland.
and then an immigrant to, so when did you come to this country?
In 1999.
Oh, so fairly
Yeah.
recently.
Yeah.
I thought I heard in your voice, you know, a bit of the Irish.
There's a wee bit there, yeah. It comes out when if I'm upset or emotional, which it doesn't happen
I
very
was
much.
just there for 3 weeks
Oh, really?
in May. Yeah.
Where? Which part?
Went fascinatingly on a small ship all around the Western Isles.
Oh,
Got to Clare and
Fantastic.
yeah, it was
beautiful
absolutely,
right there.
absolutely wonderful.
And the weather was okay, because it can be.
It was gorgeous. We were very fortunate. And then we went around and previously spent a lot of time in County Mayo and I've been to Belfast several times.
Belfast is
Yeah.
a transformed city now. It's remarkable.
Well, yes, from the first time I saw it, it certainly has been.
Yeah.
And Patrick has been to Ireland. He's
It was 99 when I went there.
You wouldn't
Right.
even recognize
I know.
a lot of it.
I know. It's
I know. We
changed.
need to send you back.
Yeah.
I'm going back in November for the Murder One festival in
How wonderful.
Dublin, which is going to be great. So I'll see some family while I'm down there too.
That'll be very nice.
yeah.
Have you met John Connolly yet?
I have not met John Connolly.
John Connolly will be here on the 18th of October with
Oh,
John
wow.
Sanford. Yeah,
John
you should
Sanford.
come over.
I would love to do that.
Why don't you just zip on over?
Wouldn't that be great?
Because if you're going to Ireland, it's essential to know John Connolly.
Yes, John Connolly's the man, isn't he?
He
Actually,
is.
I think he actually lives quite close to my aunt and uncle
He very well
in
may.
South Dublin. Yeah.
He planned my first trip to Ireland.
Did
It was
he?
so wonderful. We pulled into Ashford Castle, and my husband said it's going to be a good trip. I love Ashford Castle. It's my favorite
Well,
place
it's a
in
beautiful
Ireland.
castle, yeah.
Excellent since 1228.
Yes,
You can
and-
hardly beat it.
And it's in really great condition too. It's
Beautiful. They
remarkable.
actually spent a fortune renovating
Yeah.
it recently, so I loved it. Well, thank you so much for coming to see us.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks
Yeah.
for having me.
It was And the lights are now
Lights are
back
still
on.
on.
I know.
For now.
I think what happened